Mr. Speaker.
Lewis Wall.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Koutou katoa. It's my pleasure to speak on the Gambling Amendment Bill number 3 in this its third reading. And I would firstly like to acknowledge my colleagues who sat on the Government Administration Select Committee, Adrian Rurathia and the Honourable Ruth Dyson, and other members of that committee who seem to have progressed through the passage of this legislation in a really constructive manner. So I want to acknowledge the Select Committee. I also want to acknowledge members of the public who took the opportunity to make submissions on this piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that actually is incredibly emotional because some of the consequences to families and communities from gambling actually isn't very nice. With my colleague William Seal in the House, I also want to acknowledge that for Manukau, we've led the way in terms of responding to the consequences of gambling through sinking lid policies that our council implemented in 2004. So we know and have known in South Auckland since pokie machines arrived here in 1991 that actually the consequences specifically on some of our communities were felt disproportionately. And what I'd like to share actually is an average spend in terms of some of our ethnic communities, and this is quite startling. So on average per annum, a Pacifica person spends $13,468 on gambling. A Pākehā New Zealander spends $1,761, and a Māori New Zealander spends $2,829. So as a representative of Manurewa, as a representative of South Auckland, I just want to acknowledge the detrimental impact of gambling on our Pacifica community. And I also want to acknowledge the work that our Pacifica communities are undertaking to combat some of those consequences. And it's been quite interesting for me to read through some of the information related to the impact of gambling, because our Pacifica refuges actually have highlighted that it's one of the main reasons that women are entering refuges, because they're coming from homes where the stress associated with gambling is forcing them to have to flee those homes and to seek help. So our position on this legislation is that we support it, and we support it because at the end of the day, gambling's been around since 2300 BC. It actually originated from what I've been able to read from China, and in fact it involved dice and cards, but fundamentally people have engaged in gambling pursuits because they find it fun, it's entertaining. And I guess as a society, what we're always having to balance is the entertainment of gambling versus actually the disease and addiction that gambling is. Because whether we like it or not, there are some people who gamble who actually end up having a disease that is incredibly hard to control. And so in New Zealand, gambling is a $2 billion plus industry. And there are 4 types of gambling that we have in New Zealand: racing, lotteries, gambling machines, which is these class 4 gambling or pokie machines that this bill is trying to address, and casinos. And so what I want to say about the context of our class 4 sector is that it's not for profit. And actually a lot of money that is reinvested back into the community from trusts like the Trillion Trust, and I'll use an example from my community, actually come through pokie revenue. And so I also want to acknowledge that what this bill is hoping to do is to ensure that the monies, the gambling monies that come out of specific communities is reinvested back into those specific communities. And I guess the basic principle is that people are going to gamble, we can't stop them. And if they are going to gamble, we want to make sure that money that is taken out of that community is reinvested back into those specific communities. And so we think that there is an opportunity through this piece of legislation for that to occur, and that's one of the reasons that we're supporting it. I would like to highlight, however, and in consultation with my colleague Adrian Rudolph, that there was a proposition that there should be a pre-commitment system whereby players can set their own limits on duration, frequency and losses from gambling, so that people can actually take some responsibility for trying to moderate how they engage in this issue. Because I think that the reasons people gamble actually can be quite complicated, because they're to do with, behavioural. People get behaviourally conditioned. There's an emotional response to gambling, and so some people gamble to escape their lives. They gamble because it's an opportunity for them to make them feel better about their circumstances. And so gambling is associated, I guess, with depression, with mental health, with a whole lot of other issues. And I think my colleague Kevin Haig really highlighted that in his contribution, that is the biggest challenge. And so what we know in New Zealand is that of the problem gamblers, 80% of them actually are problem gamblers because they use poker machines. So it's incredibly relevant that we do focus also on harm minimisation and the options and opportunities that this piece of legislation also balancing the right of individuals and communities to have access to this entertainment, but also acknowledging that through access there actually are consequences, and it's society's responsibility to provide those individuals with the help they need if they are addicts, because it's a disease. Gambling is a disease, it's a medical condition, and I think people fail to recognise that. They just think people choose to be gamblers, but if it's a disease, actually you don't choose it. And so some of the information that I've managed to find out is that in terms of the addiction research, and any research into gambling is framed around addiction, that actually 50% is predisposed and the other 50% is people who have poor coping skills. If you've got poor coping skills, if you don't feel good about yourself and then you gamble to make yourself feel better, actually what it really means, underlying all of this, is that we as a society have to help people who have that disposition because they have a disease. And so I don't think that this bill has adequately addressed the issue of gambling as a disease, but in saying that, I think our balance in terms of deciding to support this legislation was that the changes that this legislation is going to enable do contribute to ensuring that communities aren't adversely affected as much as they have been in the past through the lack of reinvestment, specific reinvestment back into those communities from the monies that have been taken out. So I think that there is more to do in this area, and I know that my colleague Adrian Rudolph is particularly interested in it. I think that we can do more as a society to help gamblers who have a disease and who are addicted to gambling. I think that we've got some particular challenges in this space. Essentially, there's advertising. The government has also contributed to gambling because we have a lotteries commission that promotes gambling through the purchasing of lotto tickets. And so we do have an environment that encourages gambling as a norm. And so because we do that, as I said earlier, I think it's also incumbent on us to make sure that anybody who needs help has access to that help. Kia ora. Thank you.
Dr.